Hi, I'm Gareth, and in this video we're going to spend a few moments thinking about the Mannheim School of Composers. And these people may be familiar to you, or you may be thinking, well, never heard of them before. What's all this about? Well, we know that musical history is divided into various periods. So we loosely say that the Baroque period ran from 1600 to 1750, and then around 1750, the classical period becomes the label to take us into the 1800s. And we can talk about the differences in style between those two periods. But of course, it's not really the case that everybody wakes up on the 1st of January 1600 and says, hey, let's be Baroque from now on. Or that the same thing might happen in 1750 when everybody jumps out of bed on the 1st of January and says, let's be classical. It's much more of a gradual move between one period and another. And it's affected by all sorts of things. Political movements, social things, what's happening in the other arts, what the general kind of drift of the moment is about what the arts are there to express. So there are a lot of sort of general broad things that are influencing all of this. But really, musically, like the other arts, there's a period of evolution. And that's where these guys come in. And in many ways, they're the kind of unsung heroes of the classical period. So in much the same way that at the beginning of the Baroque period, we had composers like Peri and Caccini developing new things like opera, composers that many people will not have heard of. And by all the work that these people do at the beginning of a period that starts to shape the direction of music, when you get later in the Baroque period, you get these great figures like Bach and Handel and Vivaldi and so on. Exactly the same thing happens in the classical period. Some of the early developments are brought about by the Mannheim School of Composers, and by the time we get to Haydn and Mozart, then all of their innovations have been developed and perfected. So who are we talking about? Well, Mannheim was a place that had a court that supported musicians. And if we put ourselves in the second half of the 18th century, then we're in the right time frame. So let's talk about where we're talking in terms of history first. Second half of the 18th century. Okay, at the court of Mannheim, a group of composers, the most important of these composers being a guy called Stamitz. Now, I wonder if you've ever heard any music by Stamitz or played any music by Stamitz. Actually, when you do encounter it, your first impression is, oh, this is rather nice, charming music. Why don't people play more Stamitz? Actually, after a while, you begin to think there's quite repetitious stuff and it doesn't quite have the imagination of the later Haydn and Mozart. But then again, Stamitz is an innovator with other composers working with him. And they did some incredibly significant things. For example, they established the classical symphony. Now, the word symphony was used in the Baroque period, but it didn't really mean symphony in the way that we understand it. Sometimes you have a single instrumental movement like you have in Handel's Messiah, and it's just called symphony, but it's a handful of bars of instrumental music. By the time we get to Mozart writing his great symphonies, by the time you get to Haydn writing his 104 symphonies, Haydn was known as the father of the symphony, well, they were ready to build on the work that had been done by the Mannheim School in developing the symphony. They also made a few other pretty key decisions. For example, something called the basso continuo was fundamental to Baroque music. It was the idea that you have a bass line and that you have something called a figured bass, some numbers under the bass line that tell you which chords to play. And therefore the whole music is kind of working from the bass upwards in terms of its chord design, and you have a harpsichordist or an organist who's playing that bass line and what we say realizing the figures, kind of working out what those numbers mean in terms of chords, and the bass line is doubled up by a cellist or sometimes by a bassoonist. Well, that was a fundamental feature of Baroque music, and the Mannheimers say, let's get rid of it. So they abandon what we call the basso continuo. Now, in itself, does that seem like a big thing? Well, maybe not, but because it was so fundamental to Baroque music, it kind of represents a change of direction, and a direction which no longer is thinking harmonically about the music from the bottom up. We start actually to think about it the other way, from the top down. They were also interested in kind of simplifying things, so a kind of process of simplification. And what do we mean by that? Well, if you go into a Baroque building, like a great Baroque cathedral, it's often a fantastic spectacle, isn't it? You've got marvellous frescoes on the ceiling, you've got huge golden angels and fantastic carving and all the rest of it. Go into a cathedral from 100 years later, and often the building is much plainer. It's been kind of stripped out of all this ornamentation, and the emphasis is slightly different. This idea of simplifying things, which may seem strange because you sort of think that as time goes by, you might actually develop in such a way that makes everything more and more complicated as it goes. But the Mannheim school thinking was that, in fact, let's get rid of some of the complexities of Baroque harmony and writing and all the rest of it, and let's boil it down to something that is more elegant and maybe less fussy in terms of harmonic design and so on. So they do that, and one way in which they achieve that is they reduce the amount of counterpoint that's written. Now, I'm not going to say they eliminate it, because they certainly don't, and some of the best fugues that you can find were written by Mozart, actually. So it's not that we abandon counterpoint altogether, but there's less of it. In the Baroque period, there was a huge amount of counterpoint, but that becomes less important because we have different kind of textures. So often from the Mannheim school onwards into the classical period, you have what we call melody-dominated homophony, which is a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? So that kind of leads to melody-dominated homophony. Okay, so if we think of it in this way, that when you're writing counterpoint, you're kind of thinking horizontally and you're layering melodic lines on top of each other. When you're writing homophonically, you're thinking vertically. You're thinking, okay, here's a chord, there's a chord, there's a chord, and then you're floating a melodic line over the top of it. Doesn't mean to say that they always wrote the chords first and then wrote the melody, because quite often they would write the melody first and then write the chords. But actually they're thinking about both of these parameters at the same time. So you see how this simplification comes about, a reduction of counterpoint in favour of melody-dominated homophony. So you have a clear melody sitting over the top of something, or sometimes further down in the texture, and then you've got a kind of clear-cut chordal procedure, often with chords that are far less complicated than was the case in the Baroque period, sometimes with harmonic rhythm that's slower. In other words, the rate of chord change being a bit slower than it often was in the Baroque. We get the classical symphony, as I say, and they quickly got this going in 4 movements. So some early symphonies in 3 movements, but then they add what had started out as a dance in earlier periods, the minuet. The minuet comes in dance suites of the Baroque, but they added the minuet, making it a minuet and trio as the 3rd movement of what then turns out to be the classical symphony. They also do something very significant, which is to develop sonata form. Now, sonata form is intensely significant in the classical period. It had not existed in the Baroque. We had pieces called sonatas, things like Scarlatti sonatas that people might well have played, that were single movements in binary form, so an A section repeated and then a B section repeated. Usually the A section going from the tonic key to the dominant key, the B section starting in the dominant, making its way back to the tonic, but they were single movements. And you had sonatas for instruments as well, flute sonatas and so on. But this is sonata form, which is not only used in sonatas, it's also used in symphonies, in string quartets. It's the basis of a structure for concertos as well. And it's a form that lives through the classical period and well beyond. 19th century composers in the Romantic period still using sonata form, and it still lives on to this day. So sonata form, very significant development in the hands of the Mannheim composers. So sonata form, 3 sections, has an exposition, then a development, then a recapitulation. In the exposition, you have 2 subjects. The first one's in the tonic key, the next one's normally in the dominant key. Then the development section does what it says on the tin, it develops the ideas, and then you have a recapitulation of the first and the second subjects, but this time they're both in the tonic key. So that's a hugely significant thing that the Mannheimers got underway with. Other things they did, like they kind of give the clarinet a place. The clarinet does not appear in Baroque music, but once we get to the Mannheimers, the clarinet makes an appearance as a solo instrument and as an instrument in the orchestra, doing a great deal to complete the woodwind section of the orchestra. And what they're doing with the orchestra, that's something else that's developed by these Mannheimers. Now there's a sort of fun aspect to this as well, because the Mannheimers developed all sorts of little musical strategies, if you like. So the idea of the Mannheim crescendo. So if we over here just put a little heading, Mannheim kind of tricks, if you like. So Mannheim tricks. We have the Mannheim crescendo. If I spelt that correctly, that would be good, wouldn't it? So there we are, the idea of the Mannheim crescendo. And the idea of this is, well, we all know what a crescendo is, but you develop a crescendo through the entire orchestra by building the orchestration into this kind of sweeping crescendo thing. That's a very new kind of idea. How about this one? The Mannheim Rocket. That's quite fun as well when we have the Mannheim Rocket. And the idea of the Mannheim Rocket is that you have a fairly fast ascending arpeggio idea that kind of fires off like a rocket. It happens at the beginning of Beethoven's first piano sonata in F minor. That's a Mannheim Rocket. So when you hear and see that in Beethoven, you think, where did that come from? It came from the Mannheimers. Mozart does it in the 40th Symphony, last movement. And so on. He's done exactly the same thing. That's a Mannheim Rocket. So these little tricks that they came up with don't seem like terribly innovative ideas to us, but actually at the time they were, and you can already see how other composers later pick up on these ideas. We've also got the Mannheim roller. There's another one of their little tricks. And that's a kind of, an extended crescendo, which kind of has a rising melodic line over an ostinato bass. So something being repeated in the bass, while maybe there's something building and building and building on top of it. Now, Beethoven does this in the Pathetique Sonata. You see that kind of thing? That's the idea. Where did it come from? It was a Mannheim roller. So you begin to see these are quite significant things. What about the Mannheim Sigh? And the idea of the Mannheim Sigh was that you had sort of pairs of notes that were descending, and you had the idea of pushing a bit of weight onto the first of the two. So if you had something like this, you can hear how they can be sighs, can't they? Especially when you get some harmony, you know. Can you hear those sighs in the music? And again, it becomes a feature in later classical music. It's all over Haydn and Mozart as well. I rather like this one, the Mannheim Birds or the Mannheim Birdies. And this is kind of sort of chirping effects, this sort of thing. These little things where you can hear the birds chirping. It's a kind of representation of something from nature, if you like. So all these things, like the Mannheim climax. There's another one that they come up with. And the idea of the Mannheim climax is that you kind of build the volume and then everybody kind of drops out and just leaves the strings behind them. So you kind of build up this moment of tension and then, and then we're just left with a string sound. The idea of the general pause is another Mannheim trick, if you like, where you're motoring along through your symphony or your sonata or whatever, and then you suddenly stop and there's a moment of silence, then you carry on again. So just from this little brief exploration, you begin to see that these Mannheim composers were pretty significant guys. And it wasn't at the end of the day that they wrote the greatest music of the classical period, because the truth is they didn't. But they were the innovators. They were the guys who experimented and did all this stuff that enabled the great music that was to come later in the classical period. So they're often overlooked, but they're absolutely key to what happened later. So this little video is a tribute to the Mannheim School of Composers.